Well, thank you all for coming. It's such a nice group on a somewhat rainy day. So I appreciate you braving the weather and coming out even though the clouds look a little iffy. But thank you. And I want to thank Ann Engler and the McFarland's Public Library for hosting this and putting it on their schedule. I appreciate that and getting everything set. I don't have to worry about the logistics or anything. So thank you, Ann. So tonight we're just going to go through the cemetery, and I'm going to highlight maybe 15 or so people from the early days of McFarland. There are about 1,000 souls buried here, but we can't take the time to talk about everyone. So I'm going to tell some of the stories of the early immigrants and settlers of McFarland and what their lives were like. And as we walk through the cemetery, I just want you to be aware of your footing because the ground's very uneven and there are a lot of small, low to the ground gravestones that you might not see. So just watch your step as we're going along. The cemetery started around 1867, and I say that only because that's when the first Lutheran church was built in McFarland on this location. And then the graves were dug and placed around the church at that time. In 1921, the McFarland Cemetery Association was started, and it was part of the Lutheran Church at the time. And they were responsible for the burials and the maintenance and the record keeping. And in 1978, the McFarland Lutheran Church voted to pull away from the Cemetery Association and let it be a standalone organization, which it is today, a nonprofit organization that still maintains the cemeteries and records and takes care of the burials. And what they did in 2013, they put in their first columbarium, which holds cremations. And that's because the cemetery is basically filled up in a way. There are about 200 or 300 plots that are not used, but the people own them, and so there aren't any available lots for people to buy anymore. So, but they do have the columbarium. And then they put up a second one in 2020. And so if we walk down this way, I'll tell a little bit of history of the first churches. Well, as I mentioned, the first Lutheran church was constructed here in 1867. Well, that's when construction started. But before that, the McFarland area was heavily populated by Norwegian immigrants. McFarland was on the very northwestern edge of the Kushkanang settlement, which was a huge Norwegian settlement back in the 1840s, 1850s. Stoughton, Albion, Deerfield, Utica, Cambridge, and McFarland, and every rural area in between were mostly Norwegian immigrants who settled there. It was called the Queen of the Norwegian settlements. And once this area filled up, the Norwegian immigration continued to the northwest, went into Westby and Viroqua, that part of Wisconsin, and then jumped the Mississippi into Minnesota and northeastern Iowa. But as the Norwegians were here, the only church that they could go to was in West Kushkanang, which is about 10 miles away, and it wasn't very convenient. And so by the 1860s, there were some Lutheran services being held in McFarland. There was a little log cabin where the other cemetery is now located. It was used as a school, and then the Norwegian Lutherans used it as a church just a handful of times in the 1860s. And the minister who would run the services was from West Kushkanang. And so he convinced the people in this area to have their own church. And so they went ahead and raised the money and had it started construction in 1867. It wasn't dedicated until 1875, so it took them a while to finish it, but during the last few years they've probably had services here. And then when people would die, they would have the cemetery around the church. And the church building itself was right here facing the street. And we could figure that out by looking at a plat map of the cemetery records, seeing where the graves were, and the graves that were from 1867 and 1870 and 1880, they were further out, and then the ones further in were late 1890s and the early 2000s. So we could figure out by drawing that map that the church was right here. The first church blew down in a huge windstorm in 1881, and the congregation decided to build another church right away. So they used a lot of the same material that was in the first church. They, kept it and reused it, and the second church was built in. And we've got a picture of the two churches. The one on the left was the first church, and then a little more modest church was the second one, probably because they didn't have the money and they couldn't salvage all of the material for the second church. But the second church burned down in December of 1895 when the Christmas tree caught fire, and they couldn't put it out. And so then the congregation wanted to build a larger church, but the footprint here was limited because of the graves around it. So they bought land across the street, and where that little garden and the church sign is, just on the other side of the sidewalk across the street, that's where the third church was built, and the first service was in 1896. And that church was, the congregation moved out of that church in 1975 in November, when they built the fourth church, which is over there, and then the fire department in McFarland burned down the third church as a practice fire. So, but as I mentioned, it was primarily Norwegian immigrants who were here, so all of the services in the church were the Norwegian language, and it stayed that way through most of the 19th century. Later on in the 19th century, they would have maybe one or two services every now and then in English, but they continued the Norwegian services until the 1930s. But then during the 20th century, more and more English services were introduced, and the church council finally translated the church constitution into English in 1930. So it was many years that the Norwegians continued to dominate the Lutheran church here. And so we're going to take a look at one of the earliest Norwegian immigrants at their grave, right over here. And here we have Helena and Ingebrigt Johnson. And they came from Norway in 1845, but they didn't come to this area until 1849. Helena's brothers, Larson Nils Mastra, also immigrated in 1845, and they came directly to the town of Dunn. And they were here farming south of town, and they thought it was good, but Helena and Ingebrigt were in Buffalo, New York for 4 years. And so Helena's brothers must have been sending them letters saying, this is a pretty good place, we've got a lot of land available if you want to come here and buy some. So in 1849, Helena and Ingebrigt came to the town of Dunn and started farming. And so to put it into context, in 1849, that's 7 years before McFarland was founded, and it was 5 years before the railroad came through. So for a number of years, the early Norwegian immigrants in this area had to have just kind of a subsistence type of life where they would raise enough to feed the family, because the market was in Madison or Stoughton, and really it was not that easy from here to get, we think a 15-minute drive is nothing, but with an ox cart it was very difficult. And maybe sometimes a Norwegian here farmer would have to go to Milwaukee to really get his wheat or whatever crop he wanted to send out to market. So it wasn't an easy life until the railroad came through. It was 1854, and there was a little depot south of town called the Door Creek Station, and so then the Johnsons probably could get their stuff to the depot. And then in 1856, the depot was moved right here, and William McFarland founded the town and ran the depot. And so you can imagine what life must have been like for the Johnsons and the other immigrants at that time. Not the easiest of lives, and just, you know, they couldn't farm a great deal of acreage because they had an ox pulling a plow. Trying to plow, you know, a couple acres was enough work in itself. And so, but the Johnsons had a number of children. They had 12 children, so those early farmers needed help on the farm, so they had a ready-made crew there after a few years. But in 1870, Ingerbert Johnson was interviewed by a man who ran a magazine in Madison called the Billed magazine, Svein Nielsen. And Ingerbert had this to say about their voyage across the ocean. He said, "I left Norway in April 1845, crossing the ocean on a ship from Porsgrunn. There were, all told, 140 immigrants aboard. Many of us had received letters from friends who had left earlier, and since they praised America, we also decided to look for homesteads beyond the big waters. As far as I could gather, it was these encouragements from America that had persuaded most of the immigrants to bid old Norway farewell. The trip across the ocean was full of dangers. The fierce gales that we encountered on the Atlantic threatened us with death and destruction. The boat was loaded with iron, and during one fearful storm, the cargo got displaced, which nearly caused the ship to capsize. Even our experienced captain gave up hope of rescue. The terror and the cries of distress among the passengers were indescribable. After being tossed about on the ocean some 14 weeks, we finally reached New York Harbor in a miserable condition. Then our immigrant group began the trip inland. And as I mentioned, Helena and Ingerbert went as far as Buffalo, and then tried to recoup and recover, and came here 4 years later. And during the Civil War, Ingerbert and Helena had two sons that fought in the Civil War, and they're actually twins. And one of their graves is right over here. So we have Eli Johnson, who's buried here, and he was the son of Ingerbert and Helena. And his brother, Oliver, went to fight in the Civil War. Oliver died during the Civil War from disease, and he's buried in the town of Dunn graveyard out on Highway B. But Eli survived, and he came back home. And we have a little idea about Eli's description, because for Oliver, he was described in a publication that he was had blue eyes, light hair, light complexion, and his height was 5 feet 5 inches, so fairly short. And so we're guessing that Eli had a similar appearance. But they were both 17 when they enlisted. But also, Eli came back here, and he married Martha Johnson, or Martha, and they had 12 children as well, following in his parents' footsteps. But they had 3 sons, Oscar, Martin, and Andrew, who continued the military experience in the family, and they fought in the Spanish-American War in the Philippine Islands. And their son Andrew was killed in the Philippines, and he's on this side of the marker. And he was killed at Luzon in 1900. And so the interesting thing about Eli, Andrew, his son, was killed on October 24th, 1900, and 2 months later, the father, Eli, died at a fairly young age, in his 50s. So you have to wonder, was he sick, or did he really die of a broken heart? But one thing was written about Eli Johnson in the Capital Times in 1960 by Charles Sanderson, who was considered one of the first historians of McFarland. Charles Sanderson also ran a nursery off Burma Road. But in the Capital Times, Charles Sanderson wrote, "Eli Johnson was what would be called today a rugged individualist. He was a man of positive and emphatic ideas, habits, and temper. He was a strong man physically. He used neither tobacco nor alcohol. His aversion against tobacco was so positive that not a stalk of the plant was raised on the home farm during his lifetime. And that's unusual because a lot of the Norwegians in this area raised tobacco. It was a very good crop for them. So, and there was another brother too who was a Marine in World War I. So it was a family full of military. But we'll look at another early Norwegian immigrant. Well, there was Andreas Spurley and his wife Elsebo and their son Hans, and they came across in 1867, and so not as early as the Johnsons, but still fairly early. McFarland had been founded, and there was commerce going on here, so it was a good time to be arriving. But they were arriving in 1867. They were a pioneer family of the first Lutheran church in McFarland. But they came from the Sogna area of Norway, which is in west central Norway, where many immigrants came from. And there's one expert in Norway who knows that area better than anyone about Norwegian immigration, and his name is Lars Oyene. And he claims that Andreas Spurley was the strongest man ever to leave Norway. And so that is some accomplishment to be the strongest man. I don't know what he based that on. I don't know. I haven't read anything if he won some strongman competition or whatever, but the strongest man who left Norway is buried here. And but his son was 17, but early on when he first arrived here, he was very much an entrepreneur, and he started a business, a delivery business between Stoughton and Madison using an ox cart. So you can imagine it wasn't a speedy delivery, but that's what he wanted to do, and he got some money for it, and then he got married, and he was able to buy farmland, which is on the corner of Highway AB and Elvium Road, and the Spurley farm, and it's still in the family. It's Nathan Kirch, which his mother was a Spurley. And but Hans, after having his delivery service and being a farmer, he also served on the school board in McFarland, and his grandson Richard Spurley was also on the school board in the 1960s. And they bought the 99 acres over there off AB, but they also had 16 acres near Mud Lake, where they used that to cut the grass for feed for their livestock. And they had 11 children. But one of their sons, Oscar, also farmed after his father on the same property. But when he retired, he moved to the village, and he became the village president for a number of years from the late 50s into the 1960s. And I'm just going to wait a second. And besides Oscar, Hans had a daughter, Henrietta, and she's buried over here. And the interesting thing with the early Norwegian settlers and farmers, they really valued education. And we're going to find this multiple times on the tour. But Henrietta, went to school in McFarland, and the school at that time was a little cream color 2-story school, which is on the corner of Milwaukee Street and Broadhead. And that's where everybody went to school up until probably the 8th grade. And then if they were interested in furthering their studies, they would go to Cambridge or Stoughton to get their high school education. And Henrietta was one who continued her education. She went to the University of Wisconsin, but she then later in her career got her doctorate and went out and taught at a college in New Jersey in the Department of Education. And her sister also got her college degree and was a long-time school administrator in Council Bluffs, Iowa. So now we will find another family. So now we have Torbjorn and Birgitte Vik, and they have an interesting story. They were both born in Norway, and Birgitte was married and had 4 children, but her husband died, and so she was in Norway with 4 children. And so along came Torbjorn, who was willing to marry her, and so they were married in 1862. And a lot of, I think, if not all of the children, at least 3 of them from Birgitte's first marriage took the name of Vik when she married Torbjorn. And so they came here in 1862, right after they were married. They got on a boat with the 4 kids and came here. And then they had 4 more kids when they settled in McFarland. And so this is a very important couple right here, because their children went off in different directions, but stayed in McFarland, but had really important lives here, and their children. So we'll learn about that as we go. But 3 of the children that we're going to talk about, one is Julia, another is Elsa or Elsie, and Hulver. And so we'll see those 3 very soon. But they farmed just east of the village, and for many years. And then after a while, I think once the kids were grown up, they moved, Birgitte and Torbjorn moved to Stoughton, or to a farm near Stoughton, and that's where they spent the rest of their lives. And you can see that Birgitte is like 13 years older than Torbjorn, and but it was Torbjorn who he was on a large stack of corn stalks at their farm near Stoughton, and he fell off and severely injured himself. And so as he was recuperating at home, he contracted pneumonia and was in terrible condition. And then as he was at home with pneumonia, Birgitte also came down with pneumonia. And then there's this article on the front page of the Stoughton Courier Hub. It says, Torbjorn Vik answers last call. And so they wrote the story about Torbjorn, and he was one thing that they mentioned about him, how he was involved in music. He loved music, and especially vocal music. He was a singer, and then he gave voice lessons, and he was the church choir conductor, probably at the McFarland Church, but also in Stoughton, and they say in quite a few churches around the area. And so that's interesting to see when you think of a farmer. You don't think of a vocalist, but that's what he did. And then also, so they wrote his obituary. It was on the front page, but they kind of hedged their bets. They weren't sure when his funeral was going to be, because Birgitte was also very sick, and they said, and she might die any time. So they're holding off on setting the date of the funeral. And then lower down on the page, they talk about Mrs. Vik's death. And so rather than taking the types out of the page, they left it, and then they added more type at the end saying, as we feared at the time of Torbjorn Vik's death last Thursday, his aged wife did not long survive her husband. And so they had a double funeral. And the funeral was in a church in Stoughton, but they carried the bodies on a wagon to the McFarland Cemetery so they could be buried here. But all the mourners at the church then caught the 3:48 train from Stoughton to McFarland so they could attend the funeral. And so that's why you see the same year of death is because they died within days of each other. But here's a picture of Torbjorn and Birgitte with their children, and it's half are Torbjorns and all of them are Birgittes. And so we just have to remember those names now, Julia, Elsie, and Halvor, and we'll meet them right now. So I can get that, there we go. We just have a short walk over here. So here's Elsie Vick, and she married Stenner Thompson, so Elsie Thompson. She was the daughter of Birgitte and Torbjorn. And so Stenner immigrated from Norway, and he came here, and of course he was a farmer like so many of the immigrants. And they had a farm where if you're at Tuttle Inn Nursery, across 51 all the way to the lake, that was their land. And they farmed, and when they're too old to farm, they moved into town, and Stenner died in 1929. But Elsie didn't let that stop her. She was going to keep on living and doing things. And so it was in the 1930s, Elsie formed a band, but it was a Norwegian band made up of an instrument called the slomodican. And a slomodican is a wooden box, a rectangular box with one string or two or three strings. You can play it with a bow, or you could pluck it. And this instrument was very popular in Norway in the 1800s, especially in schools and churches. If a church was too poor to have an organ, they would have a slomodican. And because it had that kind of melodious sound that an organ might have. And of course they would not allow fiddles in the church because the fiddle was the devil's instrument. So you had to have something to lead the congregation in singing, so they would have a slomodican. So Elsie Thompson had slomodicans. I think at one point in her collection she had over 30 slomodicans. But she formed this quartet comprised of herself, two daughters, and one niece. And the daughters were Charlotte and Nora, and the niece was Bertha, and Bertha Larson. And you might know that Bertha Larson was one of the last Larsons to live in the Larson house on the corner at the four-way stop. But so they had this band, and they became really popular, that they would travel all over south central Wisconsin, performing at festivals, and they'd be in parades. They'd be like a flatbed wagon. They'd be on the wagon and in their Norwegian costumes and playing the music, and they would have local girls who would also sing with them or dancing, and they're all wearing their Norwegian outfits. And they became so popular that they went to the National Folklore Festival in Washington, D.C. and played for FDR. And they went to several festivals around the Midwest, including in Chicago. So it was they were big time. And here's a picture of Elsie and Charlotte and Nora and Bertha. And they're wearing their Norwegian outfits, and they're holding, that's a slomodican there, and they have their bows. There's another slomodican. They each, I guess, are holding their slomodicans. Maybe Elsie's is on the table. But they were a big deal in McFarland. So now we'll go over to another gravesite over behind us. I should also point out, which I forgot, of the Thompson family. They had 11 kids, and one was Con Thompson. He's not buried here. He's up at the Roselawn Cemetery, but you'd know Con Thompson if you were a Home Talent baseball fan, because he was the longtime manager of the Home Talent baseball team here. And back in 46, 47, and 48, they were champions, and Con was the manager. And Con ran the gas station just the block down on the left where Slim's garage is. That's where Con ran the service station for years and years. But the Thompson family was well known around the whole area because of all the children who went on to do big things. Ted Thompson, another son, ran a business in town, and Charlotte Sullivan and Nora Brixton were just huge members or contributors to the Ladies' Aid and the various circles at the Lutheran Church. So a very important family in McFarland. And now we have Ole and Brita Larson, no relation to me, but this was another very early family to come over here from Norway. Ole and Brita were married in 1850 in Norway, and they had 3 children who were born in Norway, and then they immigrated to the United States in 1862, and they had a couple more children here. One was John, and one was Johanna. And Ole was a farm laborer, but he eventually bought some land, and Brita never learned to read or write English. It was pretty common, especially for the women immigrants. They just didn't have an opportunity to need to write or in English, so they just continued to with their native language. But one amazing thing about this couple, Ole's parents, Lars and Anna, immigrated after Ole and Brita, and so they, Lars and Anna were fairly old, and when they came here, they didn't have any land, they didn't have any place, so they lived in a mud dugout, a cave along the Yahira River. And you can just imagine living in a mud cave or dirt cave along the river. I wouldn't want to do it for one night, but that's what they did. And they didn't live long. Eventually they got out of the cave, but they were only here for about 3 years before the father died. And Anna lived for 16 years longer, so I'm hoping that Anna moved in with her son. But they had all these children, as I mentioned, and we'll find their one son, John, who is up here. So John Larson and his wife Julia, and so that's Julia Vick, who was one of the daughters that we saw over at Torbjorn Vick's gravesite. So she's the sister of Elsie, the Slomodican player, and John Larson and Julia eventually bought the Larson house on the corner of Exchange and Bashford. And John, they were farmers as well, but then John was a businessman, and he's the one who started the resort area down on Lake Wabisa around 1904. And he would buy the land from an ice harvesting company that was getting out of the business, and so the land was opening up. And so John found the money to buy that land, and then his good friend Ian Edwards, who had the Larson House built for himself in 1898, Ian Edwards then bought part of that land and started the resort area that we now know as Edwards Park. And so you had Larson's Beach and Edwards Park, and John Larson was responsible for all of that. And the Larsons bought the McFarland house after Ian Edwards had sold it to Tollef Olson, and so it was about 1911 or so when the Larson family went into the Larson house, and and they owned it until the McFarland Historical Society, or it was in the Larson family until the McFarland Historical Society bought it from the family. And there are some children of John and Julia here. Donald Larson was only 41 when he died, but he was another great musician, tremendous musician that taught at Luther College, and and was well-respected trumpeter. And so there's also Bertha Larson, who was one of the Slomodican players, and Tanetta. These were the sisters that lived in the Larson house, and then when they both died, it stayed empty, but the family owned it. Reverend Henneke was the closest living relative, and he was up in Wausau. So it was no one living in the house, and finally the Historical Society bought it from the Henneke family, which was a descendant of the Larsons. And Larson's Beach, John and Julia ran that, and then his son Obed Larson took over the business from his father, and Obed's daughter Jerry Larson and her husband Norm continued the business until Jerry died in the late 60s, but then Norman kept it going until maybe the 80s when he sold it. And it was something that a lot of the longtime McFarland people miss, is Larson's Beach isn't there anymore, or the beach house or the marina, whatever you might have known it by, but now it's condominiums. All right, and now we have Julia, and we had Elsie, and now the third Vic name we were looking for was Hulver, and now we have to find Hulver, and right here. So Hulver is his dad was not Torbjorn Vic. His dad was the first husband to Birgitte, but he took that name of Vic, and so he came and he continued, being a farmer, and but he married Johanna, and they had four children, and one of their sons was Homer. And if you've lived in McFarland, you know the name of Homer Vic. There was a Homer Vic Sr., which was their child, and then Homer Vic Sr. had a son who was Homer Vic Jr., who is still living. But then on the flip side here, we have Homer Vic Sr. and his wife, and then Homer's grave here. He was in World War I. But the thing that Homer did, before he was out of school, he got a job at the McFarland's State Bank. And the State Bank was formed in 1904. And Homer probably started there around 1915, 1916, just as a errand boy or a supply clerk or whatever, not much. But then he left for World War I, and he came back, and the bank said, yeah, well, we want you back. And so he stayed there, and eventually he became president of the McFarland's State Bank, and a long time, and stayed president until the 1954 or 55. And then he retired to their home on Lake Wabisa. But Homer and Delia were in an apartment where the old school was. The old school closed in 1918 when the new school opened up on Johnson Street. And so they converted the school into apartments where Homer and his wife stayed. And one day when Homer was at the bank and his wife was out hanging up wash, she smelled something, and it was, she thought it was smoke. So she called the fire department, and she said, I think I smell smoke. And the person on the phone says, we don't respond to thinks. And so they hung up. But yeah, it was a fire, and it burned the place down. And so Homer and his family had to move to a house on Main Street, which was next to a wooden store, kind of where Spartan Pizza is now. And at that time, late at night, something happened to the store, and it caught fire. And Homer's house was right next to it. The fire station was on the other side, but they didn't have any way to really battle fires. In those days, there wasn't a water system. They had to, pump the water out of cisterns, and there just wasn't enough power to get the fire out, and it jumped to Homer's house, which burned down. And Homer and his wife had a little boy at that time, Homer Jr., and then they eventually moved to a house on Exchange Street, which is this one right here, which you probably recognize if you go down Exchange Street. And that's where they lived for a long time. And Homer founded the McFarland Boy Scouts, and he was the first president of the McFarland Businessmen's Association in 1941. So another important family that you can trace back to Torbjorn and Birgit Vick. And we'll just walk over here and take a look at a couple of the pastors. Right here we have Realf Brandt. He was the first full-time minister at the McFarland Lutheran Church, and he came here in 1900. And the church congregation built a parsonage for Pastor Brandt and his family, and that's that light blue grayish house there. The church built that in 1900 for the parsonage, and it stayed the Lutheran Church parsonage until 1955, when the church sold it and it became a private residence. And that house over there with the white bus, that was the new parsonage that was built in 1955. But Pastor Brandt was here for 27 years, the longest serving minister for the McFarland Lutheran Church. But the person I really want to talk about is Walter Brandt, one of his sons, and his wife Elsie Torgerson Brandt. And so we just want to remember Elsie's name because she'll be brought up later. But it was Walter, and they both grew up in McFarland, and both went to school in that little schoolhouse over here. And as I mentioned, how a lot of early McFarland kids went on to higher education. And Walter got his doctorate in history, and he taught at University of Iowa, and but he eventually ended up at the City College of New York. And so Elsie and Walter grew up in tiny McFarland, a population of 300, and they're spending most of their time in New York City, in the high academic crowd. Walter focused on the Middle Ages and the Reformation. That was his specialty. And so it's just interesting of all the younger people in McFarland who went on to get a higher education, not just college degree, but doctorates and so on. And then we have Morris Sorensen, who took over after Ralph Brandt, and he served until 1948, and he was the second longest serving minister in the church's history. And the interesting thing about him, well, his son became a missionary and continued in the ministry, but then his grandson, who was born in Japan, went and became a corporate lawyer, and eventually rose up the ranks where he was president and chairman of the board of Marriott International until just a few years ago, when he died unexpectedly at the age of 60. So he had some McFarland connections. And so we will, and the roses are on another pastor's grave, Harvey Johnson. He served the McFarland Lutheran congregation from 1970 until 1975. And his wife, Betty, who died maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And Johnson died in 1975 from cancer. But he's kind of like the bridge of the McFarland Lutheran Church from the old traditional ways to the new modern ways, because Harvey enjoyed or understood both. He was a traditionalist, but he saw the need for moving forward and bringing in younger people into the congregation, and And it was during his term where women began serving on the church council, and he was a strong proponent of that, and an extremely nice man. And so when he died, the congregation was planning, or actually building, the fourth church, but he didn't live long enough to see it being used. And so that was one unfortunate thing. So there again, he's kind of the bridge between the old church and the new church. And we'll walk up this way. Well, we have the Elvium gravestone, and it's for Ole and Christy Elvium. And they both were born in Norway and immigrated to the United States. Christina was only 1 year old when she immigrated with her parents, but they came to this area and they met, and then they became farmers, and they had a farm out on Elvium Road. As you go out, it's been renovated quite a bit, the house, but all the outbuildings, of course, are gone. But they farmed that area that's completely, pretty much developed now, with houses. But everybody knows the Elvium name here because of Conrad Elvium, who was their youngest child. They had four children, and Conrad went on. He went to school over there as well with his friend Walter, and it's amazing, they're probably in the same class, Conrad Elvium and Walter Brandt, and they both did great things. Probably Henrietta Spurley was in that class as well, and she went on to do great things. So it was really amazing. But Conrad went on and got his degrees in the sciences, and he was a famous researcher at the UW, and in the vitamin research. And so what he discovered was a cure for pellagra, which was a deficiency of a certain vitamin, and it took place in cultures and down south of the United States where their diet was too much corn, and so they weren't getting enough other nutrients by having a balanced diet. And so a lot of people got sick, and many of them died from this pellagra. And so the cure that Conrad Elvium, their youngest son, saved lives, and it was a major thing. And so he wrote like over 800 scientific journals, and eventually in the 1950s, 1958, he became president of the University of Wisconsin. And he served until 1962, when he actually died in office. Literally in his office, he had a heart attack. But everybody knows about Conrad, but not about their oldest son, Elmer. And we'll find him over here. So Elmer was Conrad's big brother, and he kept the family farm going out on Elvium Road. But Elmer also went to the University of Wisconsin and got his degree, but his choice was to come back here and farm. He wasn't interested in continuing into research or getting other degrees. He came back home and took over the farm, and he married Bessie McConnell. And they had one daughter, Lorraine, who's buried next to them. And but Elmer was, besides farming, he was very involved in other things. He was on the Dane County Board for a number of years. He was the chairman of the Dane County Parks Commission, and he was also chairman of the town of Dunn. And he served on the McFarland's school board. And he was the secretary, one of the founding members of the McFarland Cemetery Association, and he served until his death in the 1950s. And he was a member and former president of the Sons of Norway Lodge, and so he was a busy person besides being a farmer. And I think that's another thing that we find out about a lot of these old timers in McFarland. They were involved. They just didn't do their job. They went out and volunteered and did other things. But unfortunately, his wife, Bessie, died in 1940. And in 1950, he remarried Constance Barham, who was a local school teacher. And and so they started their life together. But then Elmer died in 1953, 3 years after he had married Constance Barham, and so that was very unfortunate. And Constance Barham, took the name of Elvium, so it was Constance Elvium, or she went by Connie Elvium. And so then you had Conrad Elvium, who went by Connie with his family, and Conrad Elvium married a Constance. So there were 3 Connie Elviums in the family. So when they had family get-togethers, you had to be looking at who you're talking to if you said Connie. So that was kind of a funny thing in that family. But Connie Elvium went on, she continued to teach in McFarland until 1960. And she was like a first grade teacher for many years. But then McFarland started kindergarten in, I think it was 55 or 56 when they started a kindergarten, but they didn't have room at the school building here, so they went into the old Wabisa school building out on Sigilco Road, and Connie Elvium had the kindergarten classes there, one morning class, one afternoon class, and each class probably had 30, 35 students. So she would go on, I was one of them, in 1959, 1960. We had like 33 kids in the morning and 35 in the afternoon, and she was the only adult in the building from 8 o'clock until 2:30. And so after that, she retired in 1960. I wonder, it was my class, I was the last class of Connie Elvium, so I don't know if we drove her to retirement or not.
What year did you graduate from McFarland?
72.
Yeah, my sister was in that class. She played for her a little too.
Oh, what's her name?
Mary, that's you.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, Lydia.
Lydia was in, oh yeah, 72.
Yeah, I was with Lydia's, yes. Oh, that's who I'm looking for. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Shure Johnson, but I just want you to note his name, Shure Johnson. And does that ring any bell? Yeah, the streets. So you have Shure Street and you have Johnson Street, and they intersect up by the grade school. And so Shure Johnson was the farmer up in that area. The old farmhouse is still standing. That was built in 1875, and so that was Shure Johnson's property. And so it's just interesting to note his name in the street names. But his son was J.S. Johnson, who's over there, and he was one of the important businessmen in town from the 1890s up until his death in the 1940s. And I'm just going to briefly mention of other business people who are buried here. We have the Evans brothers, Ole and Egel. They're buried back in the corner. They ran the general store where the McFarland Tavern is now for many years, starting again in the 1890s. You have Talif Lewis, who was the barber, furniture maker, and the undertaker. He had a business where the Lofgren dental office was, and his son was nominated to the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. Another McFarland kid who went on and did great things. And there's Thomas Austin over here. He ran the feed mill, and his brother-in-laws were Theodore and Ian Edwards, who ran the hardware store. And there's Lewis Harrison, who's buried over here, and he was a contractor. He built the old Wabisa School, and he was also involved in purchasing or running the Edwards Park store and the pavilion at Edwards Park. He built those, and so he and his family ran that for many, many years. And we're going to see one more businessman up here. We have Thomas I. Odom. But everybody in McFarland knew him as Bert Odom. And it's interesting that I stands for Ingebrigt. And so his grandfather was Ingebrigt Johnson, the first grave we stopped at, the Norwegian immigrant who settled in McFarland in 1849. So this is his grandson. And so his mother was a daughter to Ingebrigt and Helena Johnson. And so Bert Odom's uncle was Eli Johnson, who fought in the Civil War, and his cousin was Andrew Johnson, who died in the Spanish-American War. So he has strong connections to McFarland history. But I'd like to mention Bert Odom because he just kind of signifies what the early McFarland resident was like back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I'll just read some of this so I don't miss anything. But when he first got out of school, he was the first rural mail carrier in McFarland. And so he had a horse and buggy, and for 12 years he went around the countryside delivering the mail in a horse and buggy. And then after that, he, with his partner Arnie Thompson, started a Ford dealership in McFarland. It's where the library now stands, on the corner of, I guess that's Lexington, or can't remember this, between the Spartan Pizza and the library, that corner. That's where their Ford garage was. And so it was a big deal. It was built in 1916, and people were buying cars there. And it lasted until the 1930s, until Andrew Thompson died. But one time, Bert Odom was president of the village. He was on the Dane County board. He was on the school board. He was the clerk of the school board. And after he left the car business, he was the custodian at the McFarland schools. And he was a member of this is the really important one, he was a member of the champion croquet team in town. In the 1930s, croquet was the sport in McFarland, and they had cutthroat games here. And he was on the McFarland Lutheran Church Council, and he was the choir director, and he was a Sunday school teacher for 13 years without an absence. And then they built a house on Exchange Street, and this is right next door to where Homer Vick lived. So this is the little bungalow on Exchange Street. So I think Bert Odom is special. Okay, just a couple more. All right, we have this grave here of the Lister family, but the thing I want to point out is kind of hard to read, Helmer Nelson. And he was a McFarland, grew up here, but he went off to World War I and fought in the war. But he was killed in France like 3 days before the armistice. He was killed November 8th, 1918. But he was buried in France, but they have this inscription here for him, and that's called a cenotaph, and that's a monument to someone buried elsewhere, and mostly for soldiers who were killed overseas. And so the family had put that up, and it's again hard to read down here, but it's inscribed. It might be a long time before you hear from me again. And that was in a letter he wrote home on September 24th, 1918. And so, yeah. And so anyway, the family put this here. And but besides, Helmer, there are 3 soldiers from McFarland who are buried in this cemetery. And we saw Andrew Johnston's grave. But there's also Dennis Chamberlain, who's buried in the cemetery, who was killed in Vietnam, and Josh Brennan, who was killed in Afghanistan. And then there are also just many, many veterans who are buried here. And when you pass the cemetery on Memorial Day, it's quite noticeable with all the flags that are flying by the graves. And we'll go up here. Well, we have Bjorn Standal and his wife Gunhild, and they were farmers, just like the majority of the people, immigrants who were here, but they came from Norway. And he has this etched on his gravestone, and it's Norwegian, but it's a Lutheran hymn that he really liked. And it said that when on his farm, on the side of a shed, he would etch this verse onto his shed as well, or on fence posts. He just liked it so much. And so in his will, he asked that this verse be put on his gravestone, and he realized it would be expensive, but he said that's what he really, really wants. And so I'll just read quickly what it says. It says, God's word is our heritage and shall be ours forever. To spread the light from age to age, be this our chief endeavor. Through life it guides our way, in death our stay. Lord, grant while time shall last, we hold its teaching fast throughout all generations. And so he really liked that, and so the family obliged. And this story was told by his granddaughter, Elsie Brandt, who we saw her grave just a few minutes ago, and her husband Walter. And so Elsie's grandparents are here. And then the other interesting thing is that Gunhild's parents immigrated to the United States before Gunhild did. It was very unusual. Her parents came when they were in their 60s, and then their children followed a little later. But the interesting thing about Gunhild's father, Ole Bergland, was that Ole Bergland was a teacher in Norway, and he owned land. And that was very unusual. If you were a professional and if you had money and you had land, you usually didn't immigrate. It was the poor farmer or laborer who would come. And so when Ole Bergland came here, it was very early. He's farmed in the Pleasant Springs area. He was well sought after because he was educated, and people wanted that to help teach their children here. But Ole Bergland's buried over in West Kashkanan. And we will finish up at the McFarland grave. And so this grave was first here for William McFarland's first wife, Mary, who died on April 1st, 1879. And it's hard to say because records aren't exact, but it said that William and Mary didn't have any children. But then other places I've read, it said they had 3 children. 2 died, and then the third one was a girl, and she grew up and then got married and moved out east. So I don't know what the true story is. But so William McFarland had this erected and put the statue on top. And it's an interesting story. It's on the side here, there's a plaque that says Henry Dibble Lee, and that from Chicago. And that was the manufacturer of this statue. And if it's iron, and it's this guy Henry Dibble Lee. He owned a ornamental ironworks company in Chicago, and so he had a contract from the state of Wisconsin to make 8 of these statues for the state capitol, to put on the gate posts that would be around the capitol. But for some reason, the state only used 4 of them, and the 4 other statues were put in storage, and somehow William McFarland knew about that. And so he got a hold of one, and he put it on his wife's grave. And the name of this statue, according to the Wisconsin Historical Society, is Candelabra. But also on the other side here, I think it's hard to read, but it's William McFarland's second wife, Sella. And his first wife, Mary, was from England, but the second wife was from Norway. She immigrated here, and she had like 5 children, at least, maybe 6 or 7. We don't know for sure, but in a first marriage. And her husband died, and so William McFarland married her and had this ready-made family. And so luckily he had the big house that they could all live in. But Sella and William had 3 more children of their own. Their first child is William Jr., and he lived only to be 10 years old. And so he's here as well, along with William McFarland. But the one thing, well, I guess I should show you the statues at the Capitol, the ones that were used, so they're on the gate posts. And so I don't know what has happened to those. Hopefully they're somewhere, but I worked at the Wisconsin Historical Society and I don't think they have them anywhere. And here's an early picture of this grave site. So it looks a little different in the background.
Yeah. What was her maiden name, do you know, Mary?
Let's see. I don't know the maiden name. Yeah, I'm sorry, don't know. But the one thing that is not really known, that William McFarland was a poet, and he wrote a poem for his first wife, Mary, and I'll just close by reading that. At last her weary pilgrimage is done, the tired heart has fallen on sweet sleep, the dear dim eyes no longer watch and weep, at last, O friend, the victor's crown is won. So long she waited by the promised land, strong life clung to her, battling with death, that nearer drew with every struggling breath, until God's angel took her by the hand. And so maybe William McFarland is seeing the statue as some sort of angel, but that's the tour for tonight. I appreciate all your attention and interest in coming until the dark, and it was great that we avoided the rain. So thank you very much.